Welcome to our 3 Dabs, where your favourite fanfiction stories come to life through immersive text-to-speech narration. Sit back, relax, and let the words take you on an unforgettable journey. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new story.
Chapter 7. Sometimes you see white. Sometimes you see red. 12 years ago, Natasha wanted to cry, but she fought it. She was upset at herself for being so stupid to not realise the men were joining up with them tonight. She was upset at herself that Steve had overheard something outside. She was upset at Steve for being stubborn, righteous, attractive, honest, and good. She was upset at everything. He blew into her life a month ago unexpectedly, and he just walked out of it right now. But she was stubborn and determined to make him listen as she said to herself, "No way, Rogers," as she exited the bar and chased after him. Bucky caught the entire Romanoff and Rogers show as they both stormed out of the bar and thought drunkenly to himself, those two are going to spontaneously combust if they don't do something now. Natasha found him pacing in the parking lot and called out to him, "Steve." He looked back at her and turned away as she started walking towards him. She yelled this time, "Rogers." Steve obviously did not want to be around her at the moment. He turned around and saw her moving closer to him and shook his head. His brain was buzzing from the liquor that he had just taken in, and he didn't know what to think, but he knew he needed to be alone at the moment. He hadn't called a cab yet since he just walked out of the bar. So, while he was stuck in the vicinity, he didn't need to stay in the same spot she was approaching. Separating himself from her, he walked towards the alley that Natasha was in with Clint only 20 minutes ago. She put her hands on her hips and stopped to watch him. If he wanted to test her ability to be stubborn, she was up for the challenge. Natasha knew he had nowhere to go right this second, or maybe more accurately, she knew he had no way of getting away from her. She huffed out a breath and started after him again. Steve hoped she would grant him the space his feelings were demanding right now. He made himself pretty clear when he shoved past her, walked out of the bar, and ignored her a minute ago. There was a collision of thoughts and feelings going on inside of Steve Rogers. He wanted to be away from here right now, back in his room, on a trail running, or punching a bag. Anywhere but here. He wanted to erase the last hour from his memory, or better yet, he wanted it to have never happened in the first place. He wanted all of the doubts voiced from Bucky and Sam, and felt by him, to not actually be validated. He wanted God, he wanted to run his hands through her hair still. How could his desire and affection for her still be battling the anger coursing through his brain this second? Yes, anger. That was a feeling he could focus on. He was so angry and hurt right now. Steve was pissed off at Natasha because he felt like an idiot for defending her to Bucky earlier in the evening. Everything his brother had said to him in their room before going out somehow rang true right now. But Steve was even more pissed at himself because no matter how angry he was right now, there was still a large part of him that just wanted to grab her and kiss the stubborn pat off of her face he caught a glimpse of as he walked away from her. He couldn't deny that. But he could avoid it at the moment. Steve let his back hit the brick wall. There was a dim light from the parking lot, causing his vision to become muted, but it wasn't completely dark. He pinched the bridge of his nose and sucked in the crisp air. His avoiding her only lasted a moment though. "God damn it," he muttered to himself as he heard her heels clicking against the pavement as she followed him into the alley. Steve heard her voice next. He really shouldn't have been surprised, but she completely threw out the pleading sound in her voice that she had a few minutes ago in the bar. Instead, her tenacious side was clearly in command as she spoke in a biting tone. "What, Rogers? You really not even going to talk to me? You really supposed to be the mature one here, remember?" She stopped when she was about 5 feet away and crossed her arms. He looked down at her and he could almost laugh at the nerve of her tone, stance, and overall demeanour. Instead, he shook his head and threw his words at her. "Natasha, I don't think there's anything to explain. More lies, more secrets. Hell, I bet your secrets have secrets." Even though Natasha was 100% in the wrong and they both knew it, their hormones and emotions were flaring rapidly. She was stubborn, he was righteous. Her tone was unbelievable, and his words hurt. Her eyes narrowed and she struck back. "You know, Steve, I think I found a flaw in you finally. You're being awfully hypocritical right now. The audacity of this woman outsized her petite frame tenfold." Steve couldn't think straight as he scoffed. His throat tightened as he felt his face redden. I don't know what is harder to swallow, Natasha. The fact that you trying to dig yourself out of this right now by deflecting, or the fact that you only doing it because you were caught. She took a step forward with her arms crossed. I am not deflecting. I am calling you out. You being a hypocrite. She watched as his jaw twitched before continuing. It was only a month ago when you had your hand on my ass and your knee between my legs when you told me I could be a little nicer and actually let you talk before jumping to conclusions. He flinched. He thought of the memory and the heat of their bodies and stared at how close she was to him right now, and fuck, did it make his blood boil from how badly he wanted to recreate that image in his brain right now. But that wasn't the point. That is not the same, and you know it, Natasha. You retwisting my words from when you accused me of trying to be some white knight to you. It was bullshit then, and it's an even bigger load of crap now, he said. She quickly answered, so does that mean you going to let me talk now to prove me wrong? They could hear each other's breathing as she added, Steve, please. He shut his eyes tight as she kept talking. Steve, I've tried to start telling you so many times over the last month, but I couldn't. Just when she sounded a little remorseful for a second, another excuse rang through his ears again. His eyes sprang open. No, Natasha, you wouldn't. There is a huge fucking difference. She laughed once and shook her head as she took a step back, threw her hands in the air, and began pacing. You are so damn stubborn and impossible, Steve. He jumped at her words. Now who is being a hypocrite, Natasha? You definitely give me a run for my money when it comes to being stubborn. She crossed her arms again, retreating inward on herself, and she spoke softer now. You think this is easy for me, Steve? God, you think everything is so black and white. No, I don't, he answered immediately. I just know that some things are, and you think nothing is. You live in this world of deflection, half-truths, non-answers, and great, or at least that's how it seems. Especially in moments like this. A little. Just a little of the anger had seeped out of his tone as they actually began to talk instead of just lash out at one another. She moved closer again. Believe me, Steve. I know all about hard lines and the consequences of stepping over them. I am very familiar with black and white mentality. But in between your precious morals of right or wrong, good or bad, truth or lie, there is a world of grey in the middle where us mortals live. He shook his head. Not in a defiant way, but almost sad. Me wanting to know about your family, or upbringing, or any snippet of information for me or past, like why I heard you curse in Russian the other day, is not me being moral. It is normal to want to know those things when it is someone you care about. He looked right into her eyes and continued with a little less anger, and it is normal for me to be upset when I saw you touching another man tonight, of whom I know nothing about because you want to tell me. You want to tell me anything. He struck a nerve because her face was frozen as he watched her hands drop to her side. Her fingers started to shake a little as she dropped her head. How could she infuriate and piss him off to no end, but all he wanted to do right now was reach out and hug her to try and make her feel better. He swallowed and rubbed his face as he collected his thoughts and spoke again. How would I know any of the middle or grey area, Nat? You don't let me in. You inside my walls like no one has ever been. All I want to do is know more about you, and I am still at the front gate without a key. He called her Nat. It was the first time in the last half an hour that it happened. She didn't care that it was probably an accident, a slip of his tongue. It gave her confidence at hearing him say it. A red strand of hair had fallen in front of her face as she looked up at him again. I have let you in more than I have ever let anyone in my life, Steve. You have to believe me. I need you to believe me. Her fingers weren't the only thing shaking right now. Steve's breathing paused as he saw her lip tremble. She still hadn't answered any of his questions, but God, if his heart didn't twist at seeing her struggle right now. He said, and I want to believe you, Natasha, but it doesn't look like you've let me anywhere near you, especially when I see you and a guy named Clint being pretty damn close. Natasha eliminated the remaining distance between them with her final step. Their clothes were almost touching as she placed her hand on his shoulder and spoke quietly. Steve, Clint is my family, he is my brother. It was like an explosion went off in Steve's head. His ears were practically ringing as her words repeated over and over internally. His thoughts whirled with all different emotions. The one emotion, though, that was quickly dissolving was jealousy, which he had been too proud to admit out loud even feeling in the first place. Jealousy is an ugly little monster. When it disappears, other emotions like anger can start to dissipate. Unlike at the bar, Steve didn't move away from her touch this time, but he was still very confused. "I don't understand, you brother." Natasha ran her thumb back and forth along his shoulder as she nodded and answered, "You and I are the only family, the only people we could rely on in our lives." "And yes, you heard correctly. He misses me, and I miss him terribly." Steve gazed at her, hearing the obvious affection she had for her brother. "I will tell you more, Steve, I promise. I really have wanted to, but there are things you don't understand. So I hope you can be patient with me a little longer. Because right now, I am too scared to say anything else." Steve Esther shifted as his forehead creased with worry, and his protective instincts returned. "Natasha, you don't have to be scared." Her fingers pushed deeper into his shoulder at his words. As ironic as it was, and as dishonest or deceiving as she had been with him multiple times, he just knew she was being open and honest with him right now. But he begin to understand. He had thoughts and had formed theories. He would bet his life on Natasha having suffered some sort of trauma earlier in her life, but for some reason she was unable to share. Every time Steve went down one of these speculative rabbit holes, though, it always ended in more questions. Just like now, more questions. Why was she afraid? And what couldn't she say? She looked down at the ground. "I am not just scared for me, Steve. I am scared for you." The knots in his stomach were gone, but there was a hint of dread in her words just now. His mind was racing, but honestly, he was shocked that she had told him the little she had in the last few minutes. It may seem trivial on paper, but Steve learning that Natasha had a brother and family, and that she was scared for reasons he didn't understand right now, was anything but small. She had taken huge steps forward in her trust for him, and he knew it. He could see it in her face. He could feel it. He reached down to brush the stray hair behind her ear and tilted her face up. "I still don't understand, Natasha." Their eyes met as his hands fell to her hips as she whispered, "Steve, I am not just scared to tell you things. I am scared how much I want you. I am scared how much I need you in my life every day." "I am not used to." She was cut off from speaking any further as he closed the distance between their lips. He needed her too desperately. The rampant tension broke as the memories, feelings, and affection that had been building between them over the last month came crashing down into this moment. She may have been lying to him blatantly, but they were both lying to themselves just as much. Yes, their friendship deepened since they agreed to be friends, but it was a cover. It was a cover for wanting something more. Nobody else bought into it, and they were in denial until right now. The intimacy and desire that came out of nowhere when they met initially had never gone away. It only became a constant undercurrent for weeks that they barely stayed away from, as they tiptoed around their feelings during their time together. Ever present, their dormant desire was just waiting for the opportunity to emerge. And just as Natasha's deflection and secrets were coming to a tipping point right now, so it was the basis of their relationship. Tonight their anger and passion sparked a confrontation about her honesty with Steve. But it also blew the door wide open to what was pretend and truth in their relationship. They were damn fools to think they could get through this training program only as friends. Pretending was over. It had been a month since he felt the velvet of her lips, and now he knew he couldn't get enough. The last 2 times they did this, their first kisses had been tentative. That was long gone. There was nothing uncertain about what was occurring. The hard pressure of their lips quickly deepened with hunger as she pushed against him and moaned into his mouth. His hands moved around her as he grabbed her hair and encircled the small of her back, pulling her body flush against him. There was no more brushing against each other. The bodies were pressed hard enough against each other that they could feel the rhythm behind their heavy breathing. Just like a month ago, she pushed against him until his back came into contact with the wall. She moaned a little louder as their lips parted and their tongues met in a hot and wet tangle. She needed more, and she needed it now. Natasha's hand moved under his shirt much faster than last time. She traced her nails up his stomach until she found the metal chain she saw earlier, peeking through his shirt. She pressed her palm firmly against the contours of his chest as her fingertips grazed over his army tag. His tongue licked her lips as she rolled her hips against him. Trailing her hand down his side, she felt the interruption of skin from the seam of his boxers peeking out of his pants. She moved her fingers down a little lower over the denim and pressed into his thigh, right below his hip. Steve grunted and pushed her away for a moment to look. His eyes flickered at the sight of her. Hair messy, eyes pleading and dark, lips plump and raw. The blunt details of her image were all his dilated pupils sticking, and it all went straight to his core, coiling at the centre, causing him to feel hot and desperate. "I need you too, Nat," he said. Her breathing hitched in her throat, and she bit down, worrying her lower lip. Moving quicker toward her again, he reached down as his hands encircled her waist. He lowered them, grabbing her ass over her jeans to pick her up as she wrapped her legs around him. Unlike a month ago, he wasn't the one with his back to the wall anymore. Steve turned them around to push her against the brick, angling her body upwards so his face was level with the column of her throat. He could hear the rasped sounds from her breathing as the swell of her breast rose with each pant against him. Steve's shirt had risen when he lifted her, causing the flesh of his stomach to be exposed. She fit perfectly around him as her legs hugged his waist. God, her jeans really were painted on. "Nat, do you know how many times I've thought about you like this?" Her jeans acted more as conductor than a layer of clothing right now as she clutched her thighs tighter, strengthening her hold on him. He could feel the heat from her center transferring against his bare stomach. God help him, because it felt like an electric current went straight to his cock. He bore into her luminous stare as his grip tightened around her. She responded by squeezing even harder, and then began writhing slowly against his hips, causing a guttural sound to escape him and a hardened pressure to form underneath his own pants. Natasha grabbed onto what she could as her fingers threaded through his hair, beginning to feel sweat forming on him. He could feel her humid breathing as she leaned toward him and whispered, "I think I have an idea of how many times, Steve." Her tongue traced along his smooth jawline, up to his ear, and he pushed harder into the wall, giving a jolted thrust into her. "Fuck, I can feel how warm you are, Nat." A whimper broke free from her as she bit down on her bottom lip to find some relief. Grasping at his shirt, she waited to feel more of him with her hands as her fingers fondled his warm and sweaty skin. The feel of her body, the dirty sand escaping their throats, and the heat between them caused Steve's jeans to become painfully tight as his mind melted into nothing but unbridled and filthy thoughts. Lowering his mouth to the V of her sweater, he kissed between as he could feel her breasts heave and surround him. Steve licked a deliberate line along the exposed skin, leaving a trail of fluid behind. He stopped as he reached her neck, marking her with warm and open kisses under her chin and down the column of her throat. Her body was on fire from the feel of his lips so close to her breasts. She bucked against him and threw her head against the wall, biting hard enough into her lip now that she could start to taste blood. Moving her hands higher under his shirt, she dug her nails into the meat on his shoulders, then whined, "Jesus." "Fuck, Steve." Steve grunted. Her sound was as unhinged as he felt, and he bit down on her collarbone. He wanted her as desperately as she wanted him right now. Rational thought and the logic were gone yet again from both of their minds right now. If someone was taking notes, this was becoming a pattern. But they didn't even notice or think of how this was the third time they found themselves in public and unable to keep their hands off of each other. All of the pent-up tension over the last month, mixed with the passion of their fight, had caused the inevitable. An unstoppable force against an immovable object. All she could think about was how he surrounded her, and how big and thick he felt under his clothing, and how fucking fantastic he would feel inside of her. And all he could think about was how he could smell the faint aroma of her steeping through her jeans. Christ, he wanted to taste her. His nostrils flared at her scent, and he darted his tongue back down the V of exposed flesh. Lapping up the pool of sweat that had formed between her breasts, he moved one hand away from his grip on her. Supporting her with only one arm now, his fingers dug into her ass as he shoved harder into the wall to support her as his freed hand moved south. He lingered over the button of her jeans as he looked up at her, and their breathing increased. That electricity he felt before that went straight to his dick was palpable. Their eyes, their lips, the core of their desire, and every part of them that was touching were like rods of energy, forming a Bermuda Triangle of electricity, encircling them in their own little cocoon. And they were only too happy to be lost inside of it right now. It was magnetic as she lifted her hips toward his hand. She opened her eyes to find him watching her every move. He smirked at her and she huffed out in frustration, "Fucking tease." His tongue licked the seam of his lips as his fingers pressed against her zipper. Steve lifted her ass, thinking of what was underneath and the cause of the scent and heat between them. The pressure against his hand increased as he inched downward. He pushed his thumb over her jeans, right into her center, feeling that warmth and now dampened feeling. She whimpered as his eyes stayed on her. A groan from him followed. I think you like being teased, Nat. She let out a frustrating breath as his hand moved away from her arousal and went under her sweater. She tried to follow his hand with her hips to keep pressure at her core, but she couldn't move against his strength. She squeezed her thighs tighter around him in annoyance. I think I liked where your hand just was, Stephen. Competitiveness was seeping into the battle of their desire. His fingers trailed up her soft stomach towards her ribs. He could feel her chest stirring at his touch. She moved one hand back up to his head and pulled on his hair as she dug her nails further into his shoulder. Finding the edge of the lace fabric, he paused and stared at her. He could barely see through his hooded eyes and the dim-lit alley, but he could feel the material and knew what was underneath. The fog of sexual chemistry stopped him in his tracks until he heard her again. Steve, touch me, please. Hearing her gave him all the push he needed as his thumb grazed over the thin material while he held his breath. Her nipple hardened against his touch as she pleaded, kiss me. They both needed more. Lowering her down a little, he found her mouth again. Kissing each other frantically, their tongues found each other again, transferring hot and wet fluid between each other. It only made them both think of other hot and wet places between them and how it would feel. She sucked at his bottom lip, pulling it between her teeth, causing a growl to escape his lips. His hand skimmed under the lace. Grazing against her nipple with his bare skin for the first time, she moaned, kiss me there. Jesus, Nat. I want to kiss every inch of you. She helped him lift her sweater as he boosted her higher again, moving closer to the lace-covered mounds. His thumb hooked under the fabric, pulling it completely away and exposing her malleable flesh. Hovering over her for the skip of a second, he watched as his humid breath covered her skin, causing it to pebble. He licked his lips as he heard her plea, Steve, please. Her breast was warm as he covered her soft swell of skin with his mouth at first, then narrowing his focus on her nipple. A flick of his tongue, a suck of his lips, a graze of his teeth. He was inebriated from the sensation. Each movement against her raised pink peak made him think of a flick, a suck, and a graze somewhere else on her. And goddammit, Steve began to see a little white behind his eyes. Drawing in a sharp and laboured breath, she tried to find more relief to the pressure building inside of her as her hips fought against his strength, writhing against his waist again. Inappropriate was turning into almost obscene. Uncomfortable was turning into something almost lewd. They weren't thinking clearly. No one ever does when there is this much passion and intimacy and lust between two individuals. Sprinkle in their fighting and competitive spirits the pent-up desire, and throw in a little anger and alcohol, and now you've got what they've created. A scene that literally could get them arrested if they continued. But for the third time in a row, their passionate entanglement was interrupted. The parking lot light flickered, and voices were heard. Steve lifted his head away from her breasts as she stilled her hips and placed her hands on his shoulders. Steve, listen. The extraction from their shameless and sensual grouping officially began as they heard a couple of people talking outside the bar while they smoked a cigarette. Natasha reluctantly dropped her legs from his waist and ran her fingers through her hair that was matted at the side and nape of her neck. She let out a frustrated breath as Steve kissed her forehead, signalling that this wasn't going to go any further right now. Clothing a mess, lips swollen, faces flushed, hair dishevelled, and arousals beyond uncomfortable. They might as well have fucked just then, because all of the evidence made them look like they had. Straightening out her brown sweater, Natasha looked over to her muscular partner in PDA as he was walking back and forth, trying to calm himself down so his erection wasn't noticeable anymore. Taking a couple of deep breaths, Steve pulled his shirt back into place and ran his fingers through his own hair as he said, "We're going to have to find somewhere private, so we don't keep getting interrupted." Natasha laughed quietly, wiping the sweat from her brow as she ran her fingers through her hair again and said, "I don't think it's going to be hard to find somewhere more private than an alley, Rogers." Steve chuckled as he began to feel a little more in control. Looking a little more presentable, or at least enough to pass in front of intoxicated friends, Natasha walked over to him and pecked his lips with a chaste kiss. She grabbed his hands and spoke with sincerity, rubbing her thumbs over his knuckles. "Steve, I meant what I said before. I want to tell you everything, and I will. I promise." As silly as it seemed, the worry was gone from Steve right now. She had told him enough tonight. She took the first steps, and sometimes most of the time even, those were the hardest. And right now she was telling him that there were answers to his other questions, she just wasn't ready to answer them yet. He could respect that. He had to respect that, because the last 30 minutes was so much more than arousal and lust on display. It was a culmination of them depriving themselves for the last month, but it was also an effect from their feelings that had formed for one another. They looked each other over one more time, giving each other a appearance and nod of approval as he said, "I know, Natasha, I'll wait as long as you need. Whatever it takes." And I meant what I just said too. I want to know all of you, so I can be patient. Too patient, Rogers. I can already tell you love being a fucking tease, she grinned. He smirked back at her. You have no idea, Nat. They took a few more seconds to calm down as he kissed her on the lips one more time and then walked around the corner. They entered the bar again, hand in hand this time. Enough time passed since they had their fight when Steve stormed out, Natasha chased after, and then they dry-humped each other into oblivion in the alley. Enough time passed that their friends were not tipsy anymore but in fact drunk. Enough time passed that no one even noticed they were gone, so no one made a gesture at their return. No one, that is, except for Bucky. He watched as they came inside and raised his eyebrow. He stood up and blocked their way to the bar to have a little fun with them. You two tussle it out, and kiss and make up. They blushed at each other and squeezed their hands as Steve crooned, Jesus Buck, you can be about as subtle as a jackhammer sometimes. He winked at them, that's why you love me, Steve, as he walked back to the group. Steve and Natasha went up to the bar to get some drinks together this time, and they enjoyed the rest of their night with their friends. Present day Wanda met Steve in the hallway and she stopped him, Steve, but he cut her off. Wanda, don't he? You did great, and you got him ready for me, really. Her eyes wrinkled at him. No, Steve. You don't let him get to you. You know he is going to bring up Natasha. God, it had been a while since she had said her name out loud to Steve. It sounded like ice-breaking, just as it did when Peter said her name early this morning by accident. Wanda, I can handle this. She frowned at him as he squeezed her shoulder and went inside. It had been a long day already. The early morning rise and run before their AM meeting. The mission. The mess of old partners being thrown back together forcibly. The fighting and bickering in the conference room. The trying by each agent to get Lucky to talk. The afternoon had turned to early evening as Rogers went inside and Wanda returned to the observation room saying to herself, how can you handle this when we don't even know what this is? Steve scrubbed his hand over his beard before he opened the door. He knew what everyone was thinking back in the observation room. He knew half of them were worried about what memories Loki was going to drudge up, and the other half just thought this wasn't going to go anywhere because all they thought Loki wanted to do was fuck with them. But Steve could see when he watched Wanda and Loki that she had gotten to him. A chink in his armor appeared through her conversation with him, and he was prepared to blow a huge hole in it now. He knew what Fury had said was right, though. His skin was going to have to be awfully thick inside this room once he opens the door. For some reason, Loki wanted to talk with Steve last, but he was also sure he could use Loki as arrogance against him. Steve had been through much worse in his life than being exposed to the prey beyond this metal door. Much, much worse. So, whatever he had to say, he was trying to prepare mentally for it. He took one last deep breath and opened the door. Loki was still off his game from his conversation with Wanda. She had exposed some harsh truths. While he shut down and was silent to her at the end, Steve could tell there was an honesty in the pain and loneliness she uncovered for everyone to see. He lifted his head towards Rogers as the door opened and closed, but he lowered it toward the ground again as Steve sat down at the table across from him. Who was going to talk first? Loki had taunted him since they found him sitting in that fucking house. He clearly wanted this alone time with Steve, but he wasn't talking. He was reeling. Steve could see the way his jaw was clenched that he was mentally on his heels, and didn't he have a plan right in this second like he had with everyone else? His sister-in-law was incredible. Steve sat there for 2 minutes in dead silence, drilling his stare into Loki's forehead, waiting for him to move first. But he didn't, so Steve leaned forward. Steve tapped his knuckles a couple of times on the steel table. Loki really was lost in his thoughts because the sun jarred his head upward as his dark eyes finally connected with Steve. It wasn't just that the colour of his eyes appeared darker than his natural colour right now. It was that his stare was ominous, tapping into something that Steve couldn't explain. But it made his spine tingle. The observation room was on edge. Everyone had this feeling in their gut. They were trained as federal agents and some worked in other branches now, but that feeling of knowing when something was off stuck with them. Wanda had felt confident when she first left the interrogation room. But now that her husband had his arm around her shoulder, she just felt like Steve was going to get hurt, and she felt guilty. Bucky leaned over to her and whispered, "Don't worry, Wanda. Steve is a big boy and he can handle it. He might say some awful things, but Loki is on edge and Steve will strike. Just watch. You did great in there." Back in the interrogation room, Steve's brow furrowed as he finally spoke. "It is too bad, Loki. When I look at you, it would be so easy to just be angry. And believe me, there is plenty of that to go around. But everything Wanda said was right. You could have been a decent fed with us. Hell, you were a decent fed with us for years." Loki lowered his head and stared at his hands as he clasped them together, almost like he was in prayer. He was still and quiet. Another 2 minutes passed in silence. Steve quirked his eyebrow up at the camera before he spoke again. "When you spoke with Wanda, I know you said none of us had been genuine with you. But Loki, you first met me over 12 years ago now. Have I ever been dishonest with you?" Steve's question finally caused Loki to lift his head again. The dark stare had shifted from before. Steve could tell that he was contemplating his next move before he finally spoke. "Have you ever been dishonest with me?" Loki took a few seconds before continuing. "Captain Stephen Grant Rogers. The military as finest. The FBI's pride and joy. A man everyone loves to look up to. A man that can make someone made of stone feel love." The first stab was made from Loki's words with that innuendo. The inevitable was going to happen. Steve knew it. His stomach was tight, but his resolve was clear. He could handle this. "Loki, you just don't get it. Looking up to me. People looked up to you too. You were so smart. So strong in your own areas. And yeah, I still find it hard to believe that you threw yourself off of that path for a life of meaningless vices." Steve started before Loki jumped in. "There are a lot of things in life, Stephen, that end up being meaningless, aren't there?" Silence caused the team to form clenched jaws and fists as they listened and watched. Another attempt to provoke, but Steve moved past it. "Yeah, you're still smart, Loki. You were smart enough to be at the top of our class academically. And you were smart enough to be a brilliant criminal for years." Loki answered, "Flattery does get you everywhere at times, doesn't it? You're going to have to try a little harder than just batting those pretty blue eyes at me and calling me smart." Steve kept his eye rolling to himself as his throat tightened a little. "Let us cut the crap here, Loki. Yeah, you're smart. But you turn yourself in, and we all know it. And we also know that you probably tipped off the NSA, Homeland, and the CIA to bring the team all back under one roof. So, congratulations. Everyone is in that room together again because of you. But please tell me that you're not dumb enough to have done this also you could just spit in our faces and try to throw some words at us." Loki unclasped his hands and pressed them flat against the metal table. He leaned forward and any sign of vulnerability had washed away. All that lingered now behind his eyes was anger. He looked at Rogers with a scornful smile and said, "Everyone." The one-word answer hung heavily in the air, between Loki and Steve, but also between everyone in the observation room. Fury looked at Banner and Hill. Tony muttered, "God it to Thor and Rhodey." Wanda exchanged worried glances with Sam and Bucky. A flash of anger crossed Steve's eyes, but he took a breath and spoke as low and as calm as he could. "What did you just say?" Whatever weakness that was exposed a few minutes ago with Wanda was gone right now. Loki looked like a cobra with its hood up, waiting to strike. There was venom in his tone, and there was more where his initial strike came from. Loki spoke, "You want to be honest with me, Rogers. Then let us be honest. I was just trying to say that the beady eyes watching us pathetically from the observation room don't include everyone." Steve's knuckles turned white in his clenched fists that were on the table, and Loki continued, "Natasha would be so disappointed with your interviewing skills, Stephen." Back in the observation room, Bucky had removed his hand from Wanda's shoulder and started towards the door. Trying to prepare for the inevitable is one thing, but seeing his brother be put through the type of pain Loki was trying here was another. And his brother had been through enough pain. But Fury stopped him. "Barnes, your brother can handle it. He has a job to do in there. Let him do it." Steve brought his hands down to his lap when he saw Loki staring at them, clearly seeing how upset he was at Loki's words. Steve whispered in a low, bordering on menacing tone, "Don't you ever say her name to me." "Ah, there you are." "There's my Hulk," he answered. He waited a few seconds before continuing, seeing their roles reversed from when Steve first entered the room. Rogers was the one looking down at the ground now as Loki continued, "I love it when you show your darker side, Stephen. Let us play a game of how dark can you go. I bet you'll find that when pressed, you and I aren't so different. I bet, when given options, there are no lines you aren't willing to cross." Steve tried. He really did. He tried to push away from where his thoughts were going, away from the horrors in his mind as he said, "You don't know what you're talking about." Loki's eyes narrowed. "Oh, but I am the only one here who does, Captain. Aren't you a little bit curious as to why I would bring up Natasha?" The observation room was frantic at this point. Wanda looked over at Fury and said, "Nick, this is going to go off the rails very quickly. We need to get Steve out now." But the train had already derailed. Steve felt the tingling in his spine rise up his back and into his throat as his thoughts became less rational. He swore he could see a little red as he said louder, "I told you, don't you dare say her name." Loki leaned into his words, now squinting. "You know the story of Odysseus and the Trojan horse." Steve looked back at him as Loki continued, "I can't help recall that story when I think of Jane, Natasha. Odysseus at first glance was a noble warrior, a hero to his kingdom. But when you look beneath the surface, he was the most deceptive, the most cunning, the biggest liar and killer of them all. He crafted the idea of the Trojan horse to deceive a world that was similar to his own, under the guise of peace and respect and love, all to be revealed as the key to taking his enemies down. By betrayal sound familiar?" Steve's voice grew even louder. "Loki, I am going to make you wish you were in Stark's possession." Testing his patience, Loki grinned and tapped his fingers on the table for a moment. "Maybe a more appropriate comparison for you and Red would be the siren. Sailors who encountered the siren were tempted and lured in by beauty and sultry sounds, and then all was lost as their sanity was devoured by the creature's true nature. Yes, I think that is much more fitting." Steve reached forward and grabbed the chain that connected Loki's hands to the table. He pulled it tight so Loki's wrist crashed against the metal, causing him to wince. Loki had Steve mentally backed up against a wall, and he wanted to go in for the kill. "My goodness, Stephen. Are you rough and rowdy like this all the time? Sign me up for a romp with that guy, but wow, I can't believe my manners. Here we've been spending all this time together, catching up on old friends and old flames, and I haven't even asked how have you been doing the last year and a half." Stark noticed a bead of sweat rolling down Bucky's face and asked him, "What the hell is going on in there, Barnes?" James looked to Wanda, and both of them said at the same time, "Oh God." Steve was backed into a corner, and all of a sudden everything came rushing back. He could feel the tears welling up. He shut his eyes tight as he let go of the chain and looked away. Thinking about what Loki could possibly have said to provoke him versus being right in the middle of this room, suffocating with nowhere to go, was entirely different. Steve was in quicksand and he was sinking into the darkness that had consumed him for a long period of time. He heard Loki's voice break through the darkness. "You know, Steve, I worked harder than I have in a long time from the outside, trying to figure out what happened to you over the last few years. I mean, you've always been intense, but something changed in you drastically after everything that happened with Natasha. And then you received those pictures in the mail 18 months ago." Tears were leaking out of Steve's tightly shut eyelids. His face was reddened, and Loki could see a vein emerging on his neck from the strain. "Fuck," Sam said. He stared at Bucky, Banner, and Wanda. Wanda was wiping her eyes already, and Bucky mirrored Steve almost in the room with glassy eyes, a red face and veins ready to pop out of his arms and neck. Fury was about to tell them to cut it when the non-FBI agent started asking a slew of questions. "What is he talking about, Fury?" Thor demanded as he looked between the monitor and the room. Stark turned to Rhodey, who shook his head in confusion too, and then asked Bucky, "Barnes, what the hell is going on? What is Loki talking about? What pictures?" Worry matched the tension in the room, and after a few seconds of silence, Wanda spoke with a shaky breath. "The pictures were of Natasha. Steve was sent pictures of Natasha. 18 months ago, FBI HQ Bucky entered the conference room with his wife in the New York office and Wire and said to their team, 'Good morning, Sam. morning banner, morning fury. It looks like a beautiful day to catch criminals, doesn't it? Wanda gave him a joking glare as Banner asked, "What got you so chipper, Bucky? I have never known you to be a morning person." He grinned as Fury's head was buried in a folder, preparing for their briefing that everyone was gathering for. Wanda answered Bruce, "What got him so chipper, Bruce, is that he slept like a rock last night, and Peter was up off and on. So, one of us had over 7 hours of sleep, and one of us is going on fumes and coffee. I'll let you determine which one is which." Bucky grabbed Wanda quick and kissed her head, whispering, "I promise you get to sleep the next 3 nights. She rolled her eyes at him but still smiled. "You were too good to him, Wanda," Sam added. They continued joking around as they had their coffees while they waited for Steve to join. It had been a couple of mild weeks with cases, and people's stress levels were actually at an all-time low, with office work at least. Steve entered the room and mumbled, "Morning, everyone," as he put his coffee and the mail from his inbox on the table. Bucky noticed how Steve seemed agitated again, like he had over the last few months. His eyes were dark above his beard, and he looked like he hadn't rested well in a long, long time. They hadn't been around each other that much outside of work lately. Wanda and Bucky were constantly busy with Peter being a toddler. And Steve, well, he was all too compliant to spend time on his own. Wanda even said something to him last night about making sure Steve comes over to their apartment soon. Steve added in a gruff tone, "Let us see if we can actually do a little work today and catch a few criminals instead of just sitting around here and letting them run rampant." He had never been good with downtime, but this was not a way to start the day. Bruce and Sam exchanged glances, and Fury even raised his eyebrow at Roger's tone. It wasn't he even 80 him yet. Bucky tried to lighten the tone as he sat by his brother. "Steve, may I recommend a mood relaxer with your coffee?" Steve stared at Bucky, causing his brother to look back at his wife with wide eyes, communicating silently, "Well, yes, sure, in a worse mood than usual today." Fury started going through the morning rundown and updating everyone on their cases. Banner chanted first, then Sam, Wanda and Bucky all followed, each of them giving their updates on cases and criminals on their radar. When it came time for Steve to speak, silence met everyone's ears. Wanda gripped Bucky's arm tightly as she looked at Steve. Bruce's brow furrowed as he looked at Sam as they noticed Steve's face. His eyes narrowed at an envelope he had in his hand that was included in his office mail. He instantly looked worried. Extremely worried. "What is it, Steve?" Sam asked. "What is that? What do you have there?" Bucky quickly added. Steve stared at the envelope for a few seconds before he slowly ran his fingers over the front of it, trying to feel what was inside. When he turned it over to look at the back and do the same thing, Bucky noticed what it said on the front: consequences. Bucky's stomach filled with dread when he read those words and looked back at his wife. Somehow, Wanda didn't need to see the actual next minutes unfold. Her intuition was screaming inside of her that this had something to do with Natasha. Her eyes started burning as she looked at James and then back to Steve. Something horrible was about to happen. Her intuition was spot on as usual. There was only one thing, or one person actually, that could cause Steve to look so concerned. That person was Natasha, and everyone in the room knew it. The silence continued, and Bannock could hear Sam breathing next to him. They looked at each other with troubled expressions. Fury was watching now and had closed the folder he had been reading. He'd been in the business long enough to know that nothing good was inside of the envelope. Fury even started to stand up, with the hopes that he could reach it in time before Steve could open it. But he was too late. Instead, he heard the flap opening on the back of the envelope. He watched everyone filled with worry as their eyes darted around the room to each other and back to Steve, who wasn't looking at anyone, and finally landing on that goddamn envelope. The next sound Bucky heard was next to him, Steve exhaling loudly in a shaky breath as he pulled out the contents inside. What happened next would vividly burn into everyone's memory for the coming months. Wanda saw the agitation and worry disappear from Steve's face as fear and shock filled it. She heard the panic in his voice as he let out a loud gasp and then 3 words: Natasha. Baby. Nat. Those 3 words would change everyone in that room's lives forever because of what followed. Bucky looked at his brother's eyes as they filled with tears that started streaming down his face uncontrollably. Steve's face became ashen and his hands started to tremble. Bucky looked back to Wanda, and they both had tears forming in each other's eyes, even though they couldn't see the contents of the envelope yet. The team knew that only something horrifying could provoke a reaction like this from Steve. Whatever had happened between all the Quantico trainees over the years, and despite all the lies that had been told, no one in the room wanted Steve to suffer more than he already had. They could never dream that his suffering in the past was only the beginning. The next thing Bucky heard was Steve screaming a grating sound, "No!" His shaky hands dropped the envelope, causing a couple of the pictures to separate, so they could be seen around the table. Everyone caught a quick glimpse of what Steve had seen and reacted immediately. Bucky and Sam gasped, and Wanda screamed, "No!" Fury and Banner both raised their hands to their mouths. They all circled around Steve and tried to stop him from picking up the photos again, but they couldn't. He grabbed the pictures and started flipping through them rapidly, as if he thought he could see something different or make the images change before him. He couldn't. They were the same gruesome images he had just looked at. Steve's hands began shaking so badly that he couldn't hold on to them any longer. They fell to the table in a scattered pattern, matching Steve's shattered state of mind. Everyone finally saw the rest of what Steve had been looking at. The team stared at multiple images of Natasha Romanoff and her lifeless body. It looked like she was shot in the middle of the chest several times, and blood had pooled all around her body and her head. Bucky looked at her eyes in the photos and saw everyone else looking at them too. Her eyes were still open and filled with fear, but lifeless. All Bucky could think was how her eyes were frozen like that forever. He wiped tears away that he didn't even realize were falling, and he heard his wife crying into Sam's shoulder. Banner and Fury had their arms each other's shoulders and hands over their mouths as Steve broke through the fog in the room with a guttural sound. No words escaped him, just a bellowing sound that was filled with a sob and scream. Wanda left Sam's arms and went to Steve with Bucky to encircle him with their embrace. Fury quickly grabbed the photos and placed them in a plastic evidence bag to process as everyone else continued to comfort their lead agent, brother, and friend. Steve crumbled before them in more ways than one as he cried in his brother and sister-in-law's arms for what seemed like an indefinite amount of time. It was long enough that the offices outside of their meeting room had started to fill up, causing Fury to close the blinds as other agents tried to figure out what was going on. Wanda broke through her tears and said, "Steve, listen to me. We need to take a breath. We don't know if they be real." Steve whispered, "It is real. They be real." Everyone looked around the room at each other again, and Bucky asked, "Steve, Wanda is right. How can you know?" Steve looked up to his brother with bloodshot eyes and said, "The envelope said consequences. And because I know what her eyes look like. I know her face so well. I know every part of her, and there is nothing behind her eyes in those pictures." Everything he just saw came surging back in his mind, and his voice collapsed into sobs again as he fell into his brother's arms once more. Present-day Fury snapped Bucky back to the present from his memory as he asked, "How the hell does Loki know about those pictures?" Stark and Rudy looked white in the face as the rest of the team started to remember what had happened 18 months ago, just like Bucky had. Maria looked like she could be ill and asked, "Steve saw pictures of Natasha's body?" "Oh my god. We all knew she was gone, but how come you never told me, Wanda?" Wanda felt the pain in her memories return. She was the more level-headed one of her team a lot of the time, especially when it came to her and her husband. But right now she was filled with the painful memories, and knowing that the current FBI team was there for Steve because they didn't leave the FBI only flamed the pain inside of her. She looked towards Stark, Maria, Thor, and Rudy and snapped at them. Steve's family knew. Sam quickly added, "Why do you even care, Maria? The four of you were long gone from here then." Maria flinched from the sting of Wanda and Sam's words and didn't respond. Fury broke through and said, "God in it. We need to stop this now. Sam, Bucky, go get Rogers before he kills Loki." Everyone's eyes returned to the monitor as Sam and Bucky ran out the door. Steve's pain was only the symptom of his anger. The rage inside of him caused him to stop thinking about anything at all except for those horrible images and the last look he ever saw on Natasha's face as it was frozen in fear forever. He yelled across the table, "She is not here, Loki. She is dead." Loki leaned back as far as he could and quietly said, "Yes, she is, and I know you blame yourself." Steve didn't say anything further. He yelled as he stood up and circled the table, throwing his right fist into Loki's face repeatedly. Loki wasn't able to move because his hands were still attached to the cuffs. He was able to stand now. He moved, so his back faced the camera and window in the room. His hand stretched back toward the table awkwardly, but he was able to get close enough to Steve when he stopped hitting his face for a moment. Steve was about to punch him again as Loki spoke quietly into his ear. I'll tell you a secret, Stephen, about those consequences. He froze. Steve couldn't get the images out of his head right now. It was the darkest time in his life. His world collapsed and he had tormented himself daily after that. Eventually, as people around him expected some of the grief to diminish, he started putting a mask up for everyone publicly as he immersed himself in his work. Besides his brother, sister-in-law, nephew, and team, he had no social contact with the outside world. Even the social events Steve did eventually participate in, for work or his family, were only to make them all stop asking how he was doing. Privately though, he felt empty and almost dead inside. It was at that time that the weather beacon outside his apartment started haunting him. Steve was in a fog, seeing red as he stood there frozen, listening to Loki. Loki said, "You never disappoint me, Rogers. Come closer, soldier, and I'll tell you something more." A rational-minded Steve would never be baited like this, but he had no control over his legs at the moment. Natasha was his Achilles heel. Steve moved towards Loki as he spoke again, shh, down here. We can let the peanut gallery here. He pointed to his mouth, and Steve leaned over to hear his whisper. Sam and Bucky were frantic as they put the key into the lock. They saw Steve lean into Loki through the window as he whispered into Roger's ear. The others in the observation room couldn't hear anything Loki was saying, but were just as wide-eyed. Sam and Bucky watched as Steve's eyes shot open, and his face went from red to colourless as he listened to what Loki was telling him. Things happened rapidly next. Sam and Bucky opened up the door. They saw Rogers look at Loki, and Loki nod once at him, confirming what he just said in his ear. They looked at Rogers' face again, and he looked desperate, frantic, panicked, and distraught. Any of the words applied, but one of them didn't add to the whole of Steve's entire appearance. Just as they were about to grab him from the room, Steve bolted from his spot by Loki and ploughed through the middle of them. They both yelled, "Hey," and rubbed their shoulders from the contact. They quickly locked the room as Loki retrieved his chair and sat back down, looking in complete control. Sam and Bucky tried to run after Steve and yelled at him, "Wait, Steve, stop and wait for us," but he didn't listen to them. He sprinted by the observation room, down the hallway, through the office area, and to the locker room. They got to the locker room to see Rogers retrieving his wallet, keys, and gun as he slammed his locker shut and turned around to run by them again. They yelled at him again to stop, but he ran out of the room and toward the elevator. They tried to catch him before he closed the elevator doors, but they were too late. Bucky looked at Sam and they ran back to the locker room. They opened his locker up and noticed he left his badge on the top shelf, and they exchanged worried looks. Steve left the elevator and ran through the lobby of HQ to the parking garage. He got in the driver's seat of his SUV and peeled out of the parking area. His mind raced to the last time he saw Natasha 2 years ago, and what her last words were to him, "Steve, it's over. This is the last time, goodbye." Natasha's last words and the image of the tears in her eyes at that moment played on repeat in his mind. He thought again of what Loki had just whispered to him. I'll tell you a secret. I estimate you have about 6 hours to retrieve your Natasha before it really is too late. Only you know where she is, because only you know where you were with her 2 years ago. He finally took a deep breath and screamed in his car as tears streamed down his cheeks.
Thanks for listening to our 3 dubs. A huge thank you to 80s for creating this incredible story. Be sure to check out their work for more amazing content. And special thanks to None for providing the background footage that brought this narration to life. If you enjoyed this video, leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Until next time, happy listening and keep imagining.